This week on Jerusalem Dateline, ISIS attacks in Brussels leave security officials concerned about what's next. Plus, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu says the only way to fight terror is to stand together. And the Book of Esther. What's the message for today? We'll hear one author's take. And Resurrection Sunday at the Garden Tomb. All this and more on this week's Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Julie Stahl, filling in for Chris Mitchell. We're going to take you to the Garden Tomb this week, where many believe that Jesus rose from the dead. But first, on a grim note, when will ISIS strike again? That's the question many authorities around the world are asking. Now there are reports that the radical Islamic group has sent 400 fighters to carry out attacks in Europe. All this after ISIS claimed responsibility for the deadly bombings in Brussels. Dale Hurd brings us the story.
One day after a series of deadly attacks in Brussels, security was at its highest level, with soldiers checking passengers' belongings at the entrances of some of the metro stations in the city. This woman said, "I am absolutely not annoyed by this. If this needs to continue, there is no problem because it is for our security." 34 people died in the attack. 9 Americans were among the 250 wounded. American missionary Rocky Gathright told CBN News he had just dropped off a friend at Brussels airport when the blast occurred.
The second explosion seemed like it was right beside me. All the windows and all the glass just shattered and came exploding out towards the street.
Gathright went in to help and minister to victims, and he prayed with an airline employee. Police have identified 2 of the attackers as Khalid and Brahim Bakraoui. The brothers were known to police for past crimes, but nothing related to terrorism. Both blew themselves up in the attack. Khalid Bakraoui had rented an apartment raided by police last week in an operation that had led authorities to the top suspect in the Paris attack, Salah Abdeslam. The Belgian ambassador to the United States said that in those raids, police discovered evidence a major attack in Belgium was being planned.
There were indications that something was in the offing. A lot of heavy weapons have been found, which is an indication that something was perhaps being planned for the next few days.
But Belgian police were still not able to prevent an attack, and it has cast a spotlight on what some have called a shocking level of unpreparedness by Belgian authorities. An unnamed Belgian official told BuzzFeed News, "We just don't have the people. We don't have the infrastructure to properly investigate or monitor hundreds of individuals suspected of terror links, as well as pursue the hundreds of open files and investigations we have. It's literally an impossible situation, and honestly, it's very grave." A senior U.S. official reportedly said that Belgian authorities know they're sitting on a time bomb. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says there's no difference between ISIS terrorism in Brussels and Palestinian terrorism in Israel. Israel has been fighting terrorism for decades, and security experts say the mindset against terrorism in Europe has to change. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said there's a common thread running through terror attacks around the world.
The chain of attacks from Paris to San Bernardino, to Istanbul, to the Ivory Coast, and now to Brussels, and the daily attacks in Israel. This is one continuous assault on all of us.
Netanyahu's remarks came days after 3 Israeli tourists were murdered by a suicide bomber in Istanbul. Netanyahu said there's no way to resolve the so-called grievances that terrorists have against the West.
It's not as if we could offer them Brussels or Istanbul or California or even the West Bank. That won't satisfy their grievances, because what they seek is our utter destruction and their total domination. Their basic demand is that we should simply disappear.
Netanyahu said the only way to defeat terrorism is to come together and fight it with political unity and moral clarity. CBN's European reporter Dale Hurd said he calls Brussels the jihadi barracks of Europe. He wondered why an attack like this didn't happen sooner.
Security has been so lax there. It's a very easy target. I always wondered, do they really think that they're never going to be hit?
Hurd said Belgium will need help to deal with the threat.
We used to joke that if you walked through Brussels airport with a hand grenade and you dropped it, a soldier would stop you and hand it back to you, okay? Even after 9/11, I thought security was, frankly, a joke. And I'm not sure Belgium is up to the job to handle this.
Israel's Ben Gurion Airport is considered one of the most secure in the world. That's a result of several Palestinian terror attacks on Israeli planes and passengers in the 1970s.
In Israel, we have paid a heavy price in blood, and therefore we made a decision that there's zero tolerance for terrorist attacks in our airports. So we are willing to spend the money in extra security, that the citizens themselves are willing to take the extra few minutes to be questioned and to be patient when going through these security systems.
One Swedish tourist had this to say about Israel.
I feel more secure here than in Sweden.
Hebrew University security expert Simon Perry said Europe must make the same investment as Israel.
In Europe, apparently the governments have not felt there was a need until now to provide such expensive security, and the citizens themselves didn't feel that there was a need. Once there will be a decision that there is zero tolerance for attacks in airports, I'm sure that the European governments will implement similar security systems in the airports in Europe.
Coming up, the Book of Esther. Does it have a message for today? Welcome back to Jerusalem Dateline. We're here in the Garden Tomb, where many people believe Jesus rose from the dead nearly 2,000 years ago. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but first, we want to take you nearly 500 years earlier to ancient Persia. That's modern-day Iran. On the Jewish calendar, it's the holiday of Purim, described in the Book of Esther. That's when Israelis and Jewish people around the world celebrate the Jewish victory over wicked Haman, who wanted to destroy them. I want to show you this sticker. It says, "The Persian Empire, one Jewish woman, guess who wins?" And if you've read the Book of Esther, you know the answer. The sticker comes from the book God and Politics in Esther, written by Yoram Hazony. I spoke with Yoram recently. He believes the Book of Esther has a message for today.
Well, the Book of Esther is kind of about the end of the world. Jerusalem's destroyed. There are no more prophets. God has stopped speaking to people, and you can't see him anywhere. The kingdom's gone. The armies are gone. All the glory that was Jerusalem and Israel is gone. And the Jews are scattered throughout the Persian Empire. And the question of the Book of Esther is, can there be any hope in this kind of a world of despair? Something that ought to be able to speak to us today.
So how does the Book of Esther relate to the situation in the world today, to politics in the world today?
Well, Esther gives us a world that is actually a lot like our own. We don't see the parting of the Red Sea, none of these grandstand miracles. And still we're supposed to see God in the world acting in a world that looks terribly corrupt. And it speaks to this. This is our world that's being described here.
How are we supposed to see God in this world? How do we relate to God in this world?
Esther is a young woman swept into the harem against her will, and she could just decide, to give up and to just be a harem girl. But she doesn't give up. She uses politics, all sorts of things that maybe we wouldn't want to do in order to get to the top. She succeeds in getting to the top. She becomes queen of Persia. She's queen to Xerxes. Now the question is this. We all like favor. We all like political favor. We love it when people love us. And Esther does too. She loves being queen. But the question is, when it comes down to it, and you need to do something to throw away that favor, throw away political favor in order to do the right thing, do you have it in you? According to the Book of Esther, that's the key to saving your soul.
And how does that relate to, okay, you mentioned it a little bit, but how does that relate to the idea or the concept that God is sovereign?
Esther is all about God's kingship. But the question is, does God, when you're a king, right, when you're king of a nation, do you do every single little thing? Or do you have ministers and generals and advisors and assistants who go and do the work for you? Now, that idea of God's kingship in Hebrew scripture, that's the idea that God needs deputies, that God can't do it alone. And that you see that throughout the Hebrew Bible, God can never do it alone. God always works through human beings.
What do you believe that God is calling people, Jews, Christians, whoever, to do today in response to the message of Esther?
First of all, Esther tells us that, teaches us that in every place where we are, no matter how small we feel, we may have a role to play. And it's up to us to find that role, to use whatever resources and skills and abilities we have, to be willing to sacrifice, to make sacrifices in our standing, in our personal place in order to find the right thing and to do it. And people talk about, really we should have done more during the Holocaust. And of course we should have done more. Lots of people should have done more during the Holocaust. There's so many persecuted peoples in the Middle East. And these are people, they need us to step forward.
Is there anything you'd like to add?
I think it's important to identify with the emotions that Esther goes through, because we can learn so much from it. She has to go into to the king. She knows that her chances of succeeding in convincing him to save her people are almost zero. To learn that, to understand, to internalize it and understand what it means for us, how each of us can prepare ourselves to sacrifice the things that we know and love in order to do the right thing. That's real soul work. That's real work on your soul. And Esther's a special book. It teaches that almost better than anything else in Scripture.
Up next, the resurrection. Where did it happen? Welcome back. This week, thousands of Christians came to the Holy Land to celebrate Easter. In Jerusalem, there are two sites that claim to be the place where Jesus was buried and rose. So which one's authentic? Let's take a look.
Located near the heart of Jerusalem is a place called the Garden Tomb, what some believe was the garden of Joseph of Arimathea. Here some believe Jesus died, was buried, and then rose from the dead. The garden is a 2-acre oasis in the often hectic city of Jerusalem. British Christians bought the garden 125 years ago and formed the Garden Tomb Association. For years, they've allowed visitors here free of charge. Richard Murrian is the director of the Garden Tomb.
What we do have here in the garden is a perfect representation of the biblical account at the end of the 4 Gospels. Everything in those 4 Gospels matches what we show people here in the garden.
Today, nearly 250,000 visitors pour into the Garden Tomb each year. Guide Steve Bridge took CBN News on a tour visitors get when they come to the garden.
What we plot out is the basic geography that we have in the Bible. Jesus was crucified outside of the city walls at a place called Golgotha, and in the immediate area to where Jesus was crucified there was a garden that belonged to a rich man by the name of Joseph of Arimathea.
We came first to the place the Bible calls Golgotha, where the book of Matthew says, "And when they had come to a place called Golgotha, that is to say, place of a skull."
What are some of the main questions that people ask you when they come here? I mean, some of the main questions, certainly from Christian groups, would be around, can we be certain that this is the place where Jesus died and where he was raised to life? People often ask about how come there are 2 places, there's here and there's the Holy Sepulchre.
The question arises because some believe Jerusalem's Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the actual place of the crucifixion and resurrection, not the Garden Tomb. Constantine's mother, Queen Helena, helped build the church in 326 AD. The archaeological weight supporting the church's claim is substantial. For example, the Roman Emperor Hadrian built a temple on the site in the 2nd century because local Christians venerated the site as the place of Golgotha. But the evidence for the garden can be compelling too. The Gospel of John says, at the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden. If you have a garden, you need lots of water, especially in the dry Middle East. The garden tomb contains one of the oldest and largest cisterns in Jerusalem. It's 2,000 years old and holds about 200,000 gallons of water.
So the tomb that we have here is typical of a first century Jewish rolling stone tomb. It's dated as being at least 2,000 years old, possibly older.
In the garden, the Bible also says there was a tomb.
It is carved out of the solid rock. It's a man-made tomb, and that's how the Bible describes the tomb in which Jesus' body was lain. This channel that you can see in front of the tomb entrance is where the stone would have sat that would have been rolled across to seal the entrance to the tomb. So finally, the most important thing about this tomb itself is that it's empty. So why don't we go inside and have a look?
Okay.
What we're looking at when we look in this direction is through into the burial chamber itself. And what you have inside the burial chamber are these two areas where a body would be lain, one just down here and one on this side.
The tomb itself seems to fit the Bible's description. But whether the garden tomb or the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the site of the resurrection of Jesus, many Christian pilgrims take with them a profound affirmation of their faith.
I'm a Bible teacher in the States, and I have so many pictures and things to go back and to show them, and want to just take some of this passion back that Jesus is who he says he is, and he is the Son of God, and he did walk this earth.
As people look forward to Easter, those at the garden tomb stress, it's not the place, it's the person.
The Bible writers really weren't that interested in establishing where Jesus died. The Bible writers themselves were much more interested in Jesus Christ himself, who he is, why he died.
And that's what we want people to take away, that the tomb is empty. And we as Christians of all the world faiths serve a living God who has overcome death, who has dealt with the sin in our life. And Jesus is the centrality of our Christian faith, is he not? And so here in the garden, that's what we want people to take away, is the living Lord Jesus. The Easter weekend is the weekend that changed the world, and the weekend when Jesus died and was buried and rose again for me and for you.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Every year, thousands of visitors celebrate the resurrection right here in the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem. Services are held that morning in English and Scandinavian. CBN News in Jerusalem live streams the first service. Join us for the exclusive live broadcast in English at 11:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Saturday at EasterSunriseService.com, or watch it later at the same place, EasterSunriseService.com. Up next, the amazing story behind the film Ben-Hur. Welcome back. For many, watching the movie Ben-Hur has become an Easter tradition. There's a remake of the film due out later this year, but there's an amazing story behind the film. Everything about Ben-Hur is larger than life, as you're about to see.
The 1959 blockbuster Ben-Hur made history with a record 11 Academy Awards. And the 1925 version is making a comeback. What many may not know, however, is that Hollywood didn't create this classic story. The idea came from the best-selling novel Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ. The author behind Ben-Hur is Lew Wallace, a true Renaissance man. Wallace showed a talent for writing early in life. He learned about the Bible while at boarding school. While he didn't care for church, the story of the three wise men fascinated him. So he decided to write a magazine article about them.
I had no convictions about God or Christ. I neither believed nor disbelieved in them. Yet when the work was fairly begun, I found myself writing reverentially, with awe.
Still, Wallace had much to learn about God, as he found out in a chance encounter with a well-known atheist named Robert Ingersoll.
Well, Robert Ingersoll knew far more about the Bible. You don't preach against something unless you know it.
Right.
And so he just kind of filleted Lew. And he realized at that point, I have no business submitting this finished story for publication. I don't know what I was talking about. I need to do the research. I need to learn the Bible. I need to learn the story.
Early in his research, Wallace created the fictional character of Judah Ben-Hur, telling how he witnessed the real-life events leading up to the death and resurrection of Christ. Wallace soon began to see God through the eyes of his character. The book became the best-selling novel of the 19th century. It has never been out of print.
It just was the right book at the right time. People were looking for ways to reconcile, to come together. They were exploring, how can there be a God that would allow a war to happen like this?
After its publication, letters flooded in, including one from President James Garfield. He wrote, "With this beautiful and reverent book, you have lightened the burden of my daily life." Wallace's own burdens had always been lightened outdoors. He did most of his writing under what came to be known as the Wallace Beech Tree.
Its spreading branches droop to the ground, weighed down by their wealth of foliage, and under them I am shut in as by the walls of a towering green tent.
That famous Wallace Beech Tree is no longer here. It actually died shortly after Wallace did and was replaced by this bronze statue of him behind me. But right over here is a building that Wallace dreamed about for decades, but never had the resources to build until the success of Ben-Hur.
Lou built this as his private retreat.
Wallace designed this 19th century man cave where he spent his golden years, writing every day until his death in 1905. His grave marker is inscribed with a quote from Ben-Hur by one of his beloved wise men.
I would not give 1 hour of life as a soul for 1,000 years of life as a man.
Wendy Griffith, CBN News, Crawfordsville, Indiana. That's all for this edition. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And remember to watch the Resurrection Sunrise Service live on EasterSunriseService.com. I'm Julie Stahl. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.